Good evening and namaskar everyone. I am Srijani representing Voices from the Periphery, and it is both a profound privilege and an honor to welcome all of you to today's much anticipated lecture, Religion, Institutions and the State in Early Medieval India. This evening holds special significance for us as we are joined by an eminent historian and scholar of early Indian history, Professor R. Mahalakshmi. She has contributed a distinguished body of work that explores intersections of religion, gender, and society in the subcontinent. She is currently a professor at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where she has been a vital presence in nurturing critical historiographical inquiry and interdisciplinary thought. A graduate of the University of Delhi and a doctoral scholar from JNU, Professor R. Mahalakshmi has consistently challenged conventional historical narratives through her inclusive readings of textual and material sources. Her research has particularly illuminated the dynamics of religious communities, devotional cultures, and gendered identities in early South India. Among her most celebrated works is The Making of the Goddesses Kali in Early Indian Traditions, published by Penguin Books in 2011, a path-breaking study that blends textual analysis with a rich cultural historical approach to trace the evolving iconography and worship of the goddess Kali. This book stands as a landmark in feminist historiography and religious studies in India. Her academic interests span a wide spectrum from Tamil Bhakti traditions and sacred geographies to questions of caste, embodiment, and subaltern religiosity. Her scholarship is marked by a rigorous engagement with Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Tamil sources, as well as an openness to critical theory and feminist epistemologies. She has also made substantial contributions to the historiography of South India, problematizing the binary of North South and expanding the discourse on regionalism and local history. Professor Mahalakshmi's work is frequently referenced in courses on gender history, early Indian religion, and post colonial historiography, both within India and abroad. Beyond her research and teaching, she is a committed mentor and public intellectual, engaging in dialogues about heritage, secularism, and the politics of the past in contemporary India. She has also served on various editorial boards, research committees, and national academic panels, further contributing to the shaping of historical pedagogy and public scholarship in India. Her intellectual clarity, ethical scholarship, and commitment to inclusive history making continue to inspire generations of students and scholars alike. We are truly privileged to have her with us today, and we look forward to an enriching session. Thank you. Ma'am, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Srijani, and thank you, Voices from the Periphery, for inviting me to come and speak, in your forum. And I'd also like to thank all those who have joined in for this program. Let me begin by saying that Voices from the Periphery had reached out to me about 3 months ago, and I apologize that I could not, deliver this lecture earlier. But in a way, I'm glad that it's happening at this moment because I'm in the throes of my writing and engagement with the history of the Cholas. And it is in that context that I thought that I will situate my theme, which is religion, institutions, and the state in early medieval India. I can see, I presume that there are some historians, but that there may be people who are not historians as well in this audience. And so, just to make it very clear, I'd like to. I'd like to. Begin by talking about this theme itself. Why is it important to talk about this theme? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yeah. Just in case, because I'm not really going to be able to see the screen with all of you, if there's any issue, please just speak. and let me know.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
Right. So let me tell you about why I decided to focus on this particular theme. Why it is absolutely important and imperative for us as scholars to look at the way in which religious and political authority are imbricated in institutions that are interwoven. They are linked to each other, and that interlinkage is what is very important for us as historians to study, certainly for us in any of the social sciences to understand and take cognizance of. The reason I say this is because we tend to separate these, and there is a commonsensical WhatsApp history, WhatsApp intellectualism that is very much the fashion of the day, which encourages us to separate these, that religion and the state are separate. I mean, it's not a big deal about who does pran pratishtha where and so on, that as if these are just incidental things. This is more about people's astha, people's devotion, and so on. No, even historically, this was never just about people's devotion. Sure, there is something called people seeking of religion, relief through religion, and so on. But religion is not something that's just out there that people reach out to. There is a certain way in which they approach religion, and that is through intermediaries in the form of the ritualists, the specialists who guide you on the way to seeking whatever it is that you are. And the other aspect of it is that there is a structure that is created through texts. So there is a prescriptive language for the way in which you approach your religion that is provided to us. And the third thing is that there is a cultural hegemony that is also projected in terms of how you pursue a religion, right? Which religion are you pursuing? What are the features of that religion vis-a-vis another? And the kind of hegemonic stress that is placed, or importance that is placed to a specific kind of tradition, which has a hold on the lives and minds of people. So these become very, very important ways in which our access to religion is mediated, not just today, but also in pre-modern times. The state clearly is something, again, that is not just accidentally there. It appears because of certain political economic transformations that take place, and there are changes, there are transformations of the nature of the state, but there are also ways in which the state across historical time and even in modern times uses certain structures. So again, I come back to the issue of a structure. Structure meaning something that is binding, something that is actually providing a scaffolding. And what is that scaffolding? It is the institutions that are created that provide that kind of scaffolding. So what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the religion and the state, so this topic for today could have very easily been institutions in early medieval India, and I would have brought in religion and the state while talking about institutions. I deliberately kept it as early medieval India and not early medieval South India, because again, the way in which we understand these processes is in terms of the ramifications, the suggestions they give us for understanding religion and the state, and the institutions that are created to promote religion and state authority in different parts of the subcontinent. So we do have similar kinds of processes that are there in very, very different regions. Can you see my next slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Now you can. Yeah. So, in early medieval India, so what is early medieval India? Let me first define the time period that I'm talking about. It's broadly this period from the 6th century AD to the 13th century. So, 6th century CE of the Common Era, the first millennium, second half of the first millennium CE, and the first half or the first quarter of the second millennium CE. So that's the period that we talk of as early medieval. Have been many debates about why we call this the early medieval. Earlier scholars writing in the 1900s, 20s, 30s, some even today, will just see this as, see the historical flow as a seamless litany of dynasties, one after the other. They are coming, they are ruling, they are going, they are replaced by another, and so on. But then, from the late 40s, but particularly from the 50s, scholars started arguing from a political economic perspective that we need to differentiate between different time periods depending on the nature of the political economy. And it is in that context that the idea of a transition or transformation that is occurring from about the 6th century. So even that is something that was debated initially. Some scholars like Didi Kosambi were pushing the date much earlier, to the second, third century AD itself, and then you have a shift. Then it was moved to the fourth, fifth centuries, and then largely the kinds of processes that are seen, many scholars agree these can be identified from the 6th century AD. Now, again, chronologies can't be very fixed because we are talking about different paces of historical change in different contexts. So, in that sense, to see this 6th century as really something that can be flexible. It can be something that's starting the 5th century somewhere, it can be starting the 7th or even 8th century elsewhere. But nevertheless, there is for at least the South Indian context from the 6th century, that is, here I'm talking of the broad South Indian, peninsular Indian context, from the Deccan going to the extreme south. It is the 6th century that we will see as a watershed, where there are many changes that are taking place. Now, amongst the many changes that are taking place, what has been argued by scholars like B.D. Chattopadhyay is, and his wonderful work, his essay, Political Processes, talks about what is this early medieval period. This is a period when you see local chiefs who begin to aggrandize territorially and also in other ways. They take on titles, they claim to be great rulers, and they annex other regions, other localities, and gradually there is a pan regional presence that they create for themselves. Herman Kulke has actually gone through, the inscriptions from Odisha, where he has shown very methodically different phases of that transformation that is happening from Dakshina Kosala to other parts, how they are all becoming part of one Odissan region that is emerging. Of course, it does not conform exactly to modern, geographical limits of Odisha, but nevertheless, that there is some kind of a regional identity that is emerging in Odisha. What B.D. Chattopadhyay did was he pointed to many such instances, be it Odisha, be it Tamil Nadu, be it Karnataka, be it Rajasthan, in all of these, be it Maharashtra, in all of these regions, what we find is that there is some kind of a regional formation that is emerging, right? I do have a comment to make on what we call regional formation, because generally the understanding is North Indian developments which occurred up till the early centuries of the Common Era, that is, a pan-Indian thing, and the rest is regional formation. I would argue that you already have some kind of a formation that is happening in northern India. And this is, something that has been talked about by scholars like R.S. Sharma, by Romila Thapar, looking at the mid-Gangetic plains, looking at the way in which state society emerges over here and how it leads to a certain kind of culture, a certain kind of regional identity that emerges over there. So actually, we already see that kind of regional identity that is emerging to a certain extent in northern India. But what B.D. Chattopadhyay is talking about is a different kind of regional identity where language also is evolving, where a cultural idiom is also evolving that is quite distinctive in these different regions, right? And why do we say it is different? It is different primarily because there is the other, which is the already established Sanskritic North Indian culture and state, as we have seen in the first millennium BC. And so, one should always keep that in mind, that when we are talking about this kind of a transformation, always the point of comparison is with something that has already come about, and that is why this is different, and that is why here we can talk about a very self-conscious regional identity, because this self-conscious regional identity is vis-a-vis something else, or at least it differentiates itself from that, right? So it may not be a contestation, but there is a separateness that is really being talked about. Now, in this early medieval context, then, so having delineated that context, what we have is in the extreme south of India, from the 6th to the 9th centuries, you have these states that are coming up. Now, up till now, we had been arguing, because of the kind of evidence that we had, that possibly we didn't really have a full-fledged monarchical state system in South India. But recent excavations in Tamil Nadu especially are kind of making us question this. I wouldn't say it is conclusive, but certainly there is some questioning of this assumption that there is no full-fledged monarchy. However, we need to have much more information before we can talk about that. But what we do see definitely in this period that we call the Pallava Pandya period, Pallavas ruling in northern Tamil Nadu and Pandyas ruling in the southern part of Tamil Nadu. Pallavas with their center around Kanchipuram and the Pandyas with their center around Madurai. That it is during their rule from the 6th to the 9th century that we actually see the beginnings of a state, full-fledged monarchical state that has emerged. And secondly, what we do see is that there is a carving out of a region with the assertion of a distinct identity to it. This is not it is not a definitive assertion as yet. Between the 6th and the 9th centuries, the Pallavas and Pandyas are, especially the Pallavas. Let's talk about the Pallavas because they come in the first. From the 3rd century CE itself, we find the Pallavas present, but they are present in southern Andhra Pradesh. So that is where mostly we find the inscriptions. But what do all these rulers do? These states do, they issue inscriptions. They have these engraved, and these inscriptions essentially convey some very important information related to either religion. They definitely relate to religion, but they also relate to other matters, which is what we refer to as political economy. Now, in these inscriptions, so here we have in the southern Andhra region already the Pallava inscriptions, which are issued in a language called Prakrit. right? Now we know that Ashokan edicts are issued in Prakrit, but thereafter, from the time of Rudradaman, when you have this very flowery Sanskrit that is being used in inscriptions, you do have gradually Sanskrit as the medium of expression that has come in parts of North India, and this is something that we find absent in the Pallava records. But gradually, from the 6th century, when they have now actually moved completely into northern Tamil Nadu and have made that their base, the base of their state, what we find is that they are beginning to use Sanskrit more and more. They sometimes use that Sanskrit with a Grantha script, a special kind of script that comes up to accommodate the Sanskrit language in this region. So you have them using that. Sometimes they have a Telugu or a Kannada script also that they are using in their things, and it is only gradually that they begin to use Tamil in their inscriptions. So all of these are just bits of information at the moment, but you will see how I will try to bring these together. What is also happening during the Pallava period? You have religious institutions that are becoming visible to us. How are they visible? Through the inscriptions of the Pallavas and the Pandyas. And what are these religious institutions? You have references to the Sangha, mainly the Jain Sanghas that are available in the Pallava inscriptions, but we also have literature that belongs to the 6th, 7th centuries and so on, and even going up to the 10th century, which is telling us that Buddhism also flourished in the region. So you have the Buddhist and the Jain Sanghas that was certainly there. We have also from the Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicles knowledge of very large monasteries in Kanchipuram, in Madurai, in other parts of Tamil Nadu, where the monks were very well versed in the sacred texts of the Buddhists, and they were in fact going to Sri Lanka to help in the editing and the redacting of the text, that is the teachings of the Buddha, to actually put them into proper canonical form. You have these monks who were actually going there. So we have a lot of cross referencing and information that allows us to know of the importance of Buddhism and Jainism in the region. And then the other important thing that happens is we have the very conspicuous presence of the Brahmadeya and the temple. What is the Brahmadeya? The Brahmadeya is a grant that is made to Brahmins, to the Brahmanas, and these are mostly in the form of villages where they are brought in to settle, and there is they are actually encouraged to pursue their religious studies and perform certain functions related to their expertise, and that is why they have been given these villages. The other thing is that you have mention of the construction of temples, and these again are very interesting because here you have the building of the temples to Puranic gods. Right now, the Brahmadeyas are given to Brahmins who are pursuing very different kinds of religious knowledge. So there are the Vedic Brahmins. Then you have those who are very well versed in the Dharma Shastras. So Manu Dharma Shastra, Apastamba, Gautama, and so on. So you have all these, and in the Grihya Sutras, that is the household ritual. So they are supposed to be specialists in all these prescriptive texts, which are all part of the Vedic and post-Vedic traditions. And then we have specialist Brahmins who know the epics, and that they are meant to be well versed in the epics and to perform also on the basis of the epics. And and then finally you have these Brahmins who are supposed to worship the Puranic gods. So Purans are a new kind of source that is available from the early centuries, from the 3rd century generally, although they may have been in existence earlier, but the in terms of the texts we generally date them from the 3rd century AD. So you have the Purans, which are now giving us a new kind of religious universe where the gods Vishnu and Shiva and later Devi become the main objects of worship. So you have the Purans telling us stories about these gods and goddesses, about the way in which they overcome various difficulties that the gods in general are facing, from the demons, from the asuras and the rakshasas, the kind of benevolence of these gods and goddesses, the boons that they give those who worship them, etc. So this is what the Purans are broadly telling us about. And these Brahmins are then supposed to also be the persons who will perform worship to the Puranic deities, and they also become the ones who transmit the Puranic knowledge in the region. The temples then are part of the Puranic religion, uh, which tells the devotee, the Puranas tell the devotee, the worshipper, you don't need to perform a sacrifice to be religious or to gain merit. What you do is you go to a place, you go to a tirtha, you go to a temple and you worship over there. So the Brahmins are now becoming, the priests within these temples, which are being constructed by the rulers in these different states that are coming up in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. And then you also have another institution, which is the Matha, which is the Brahminical organization that allows those who are renunciates, those who have given up the householder's life and who have joined full time in terms of being dedicated to the religion. Now, what we have as political institutions, I'm only separating these because just technically this is how we normally think of them. The political institutions are kingship itself is an institution, monarchy itself is an institution, and therefore you have a certain way in which kingship is to be presented, it is to be perpetuated. You have administrative institutions, and so you have all these various officers who are supposed to, and the council of ministers who are supposed to assist the king, but you also have a military establishment, a revenue establishment. So when we talk about state, generally these are the kinds of things that demarcate or that differentiate a pre-state from a state, and these are clearly visible to us in the early medieval period, certainly in the Pallava, Pandya and Chola inscriptions and other sources related to this period. Now, just to give you an idea of what these inscriptions are from, I'm sure all of you recognize this image that is there on the slide. It is from Mamalapuram. It is traditionally referred to as the Panchapandava Ratha. Of course, it has nothing to do with the Panchapandavas, and we certainly cannot associate that name with this. It is more of a local usage or a local reference that is there. And we don't even know how local that local is because it comes up during colonial times and it's recorded then. So what we have is these monuments that are coming up, right? And Mahabalipuram is one of those very, very important places which has numerous monuments where there is a temple that is being carved out in the hills itself. There are caves, natural caves that are there, but also artificial caves that are being created, and there are images of gods that are being kept there, or there are places that are being created for the Jains to go and worship over there. You have murals that are being painted over there, and so on. So you have numerous such instances that are available to us that are telling us of a very interesting source that attests to the transformations that are taking place in the region. You do not have such evidence, you do not have such monumental activity for the earlier period. Now, this let's just look at this very interesting. The first inscription that we have that belongs to the middle of the 6th century. It is issued by Simhavarman. It's called the Pallankoil copper plate, and it is a Jaina inscription. Okay, it is dedicated for a Jaina religious establishment. But what are the things that it is talking about? It is talking about lands that are being given to this Jain establishment. And related to the lands, what is it telling us about? It's telling us about the tanks that were there. Yeah, they were called Aries. Yeah. Then you have the canis or the wells that are being talked about, the athams or the water lifts that are being talked about. Yeah. Then we have reference to wetlands, dry lands, meadows, forests, hamlets, wastelands, wells. Also reference to ownership rights. Who has ownership? What kind of ownership rights is it? Is it of a superior kind, or is it of an inferior kind? And also it tells us about certain kinds of tax exemptions that are given to the Jain establishment on these lands that have been given. Now, this is where I would like to, pinpoint that when we talk about institutions and we try to separate religious institutions from political institutions, when we actually look at the evidence that is available to us, what we see is that this separation is almost impossible. In fact, it seems quite ridiculous for us to do it, because what is being created, the religious institution is being given a gift. Now, for that gift to be operational, there is a very specific political economic aspect that is highlighted in these records, and that relates to the way in which the land has to be now understood, who has ownership over the land, who actually has control over the water that is going there in the land, and so on. So this is a very, very important element that we need to keep in mind. Now, as I've already mentioned, Mahendra Varman the First actually inaugurates the Pallava monumental activity, not just in Mamallapuram, but also in many other places. And then his successors, Narasimha Varman and various others, they continue with that tradition where monumental activity becomes very, very active, becomes very, very prominent. And what we also find is that this kind of land granting to religious institutions, which the Pallankoil copper plate, as the first such attestation, tells us, is something that continues. In fact, it becomes more and more complex and complicated. Now, let's look at a grant that is given a century later, in the mid 7th century, to a Brahminical temple. But what we have in this grant of Parameshwara Varman the First is that it is addressed to all the villagers. There are many officials that are named over here, and it is talking about the many kinds of exemptions. Sarva Kara Parihara. So the different kinds of taxes which are now being exempted from the land. So it's just becoming more and more complicated. It's becoming more and more detailed. And also you can see that there is an addressing of the issues, not merely in terms of the recipients, but also in terms of the people. Meaning that what is happening is that people are already living and cultivating these agricultural lands, and through this act of giving, in many instances we have references to those villagers who are there, or those cultivators who are there, who are actually removed from the land. Now, this is not yet so prominent here in the Pallava grants, but we can presume that this is a process that is happening. Yeah, what we find is from this time period, the importance of agriculture for the state is very well understood. The importance of agrarian surpluses is very well understood, which is why not merely are they interested in the Neer Nilam, the wetlands, but they are also talking about the Punsei, which is making better, which are the dry lands, which are now the Punsei lands, which are to be made Nansei. Making it better. This comes up particularly in the Chola period, but there's already understanding that is there, which these grants are allowing us to see. There is also references to forests that are being cut down, so arikade, or which are being burned, erikade. So you have many such things which are giving you very, very interesting information about the nature of the religio-political institutions. Now, when we come to the Chola period, what we have is numerous, thousands of inscriptions, which are actually telling us about the piety of the rulers and of other people, because they're all, as I've already mentioned, in the context of religious donations. So it is telling us about how pious they are. But on the other hand, it is also telling us about the extent to which the state is controlling lands. And even in the Pallava period, you have numerous references to hundreds of Brahmins who are being brought and who are being settled in various places. Now, even from the Dharmashastric point of view, we see that the Brahmins are not supposed to be cultivating lands. Now, the inscriptions themselves are saying they are not supposed to cultivate lands. They're not saying they are not supposed to. They're saying, but they have to do their own work, which is pursue their religious knowledge. And so, who is cultivating their lands? There are others who are cultivating their lands. So this is an important element, meaning that the cultivator is gradually being made to part with his surpluses. And these are being taken in the form of taxes, of course, by the state, but they are also being taken and given to the Brahmins, and they are also the cultivators are now also being brought in to cultivate the fields in the lands that are granted if they already are living over there. Now, in the Chola period, as I've already mentioned, you have over 10,000 grants that are available. And here we find that it's not merely northern Tamil Nadu or, any particular period. You have any particular region, you have the entire Tamil macro region, which is gradually being brought under the control through territorial conquest, but also through these acts of religious devotion. And what are these acts of religious devotion? Building a temple close to Kanchipuram, or in Uttaramerur, or in some other place, or in Chidambaram, or in Tanjavur, or Trichy, or near Madurai, and so on. So across the Tamil macro region, what is happening is that the Cholas are leaving their mark. One through conquest, as I've already mentioned, and the second is by making these monumental buildings, which are actually temples to the Puranic gods, primarily to Shiva, but also numerous ones to Vishnu. And in addition to that, they were also great patrons of the Jains, and to a lesser extent, it appears, also to the Buddhists. Now, let's look at this early Chola ruler, Parantaka Chola. We have a copper plate inscription that belongs to the 25th regnal year, I think that is 932. And in that particular inscription, we have references to 3 villages that are being granted. And here you have a certain amount of paddy, you have coins that are being given, you have a paddy tax that is referred to, you have a pon irai that is talked of, ur karanjit. Karanjit is a gold value. So they're talking about a tax which is on the ur itself, and then it is ur panakari, which is of a certain kind of measure to measure grain. Then you have a tax on hours or cows. Then you have on erudu or oxen. Then you have on nadu, you have a tax. You have on grain various taxes, and then even on tarah and tari. You have, which is on trade or usury, and on looms. Then there are also interestingly taxes on communities like the Iravas, who are toddy tappers. There is a tax on them, right? And there is the Idayar, who are the herders. There is a tax on them as well. So what we can see is gradually the state's institutional mechanisms are becoming much more complex. It's going much deeper and trying to tap the economic resources. So when a land is being given, when a village is being given, what it is claiming as an act of devotion is that you have the land itself and the paddy that is grown from there. That
Ma'am,
yes.
ma'am, so sorry to interrupt, but we are at the second slide still. Ma'am,
Oops.
are you trying to show a new slide?
Yes. Thank you
Ma'am,
for.
which is
This
it the
is the one.
third slide? Ma'am? Okay, okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we find in these various transactions is that communities who might not actually be cultivators are also being brought in. The taxes that are collected from them are also being taken, and they are being granted now to the religious institutions to which these lands are being granted, and so on. Right. So this is a process that, as you can see from the inscription of Parantaka, becomes much more pronounced. And this is the phase that we refer to as the early Chola phase. So around 850 AD or 850 CE, you have Vijayalaya, the founder of the early medieval Chola line, who comes to power. And it is in Parantaka's time, so late 9th century, but early 10th century is actually the time when you can see the Cholas actually gaining a stronghold and able to expand not merely territorially, but also in terms of the way in which they are zeroing in on their resource bases. Now, I'm going to the second part of the 10th century, second half of the 10th century, to another ruler called Sundara Chola, who is the father of Rajaraja Chola. But over here, let's just look at these plates that he issued, the unbilled plates, where you have such detailed references to the land that has been granted. What are they saying? What all comprises of the village land? All the trees that are above the surface of the earth. Can you see this slide with Sundara Chola?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All the trees that stand above the surface of the earth, the wells, the gardens, the pastures, the public places, the mandrams, the residential sites, the urnatams, and hills are also being covered here. Then there are platforms that are created at the foot of the trees, the tetris. Those are also being counted. Ponds are being counted. Inundated rivers, so the river flood banks that are there, those are also being taken. River beds are being taken. All mansions and large palaces and so on. And then it tells us that there are also certain kinds of taxes and fines that are being taken. Now, what you can see over here is that it is talking about the Mandrapad. So this is the tax that is given for any offenses. Or a fine, you can say, for any offenses. So legal system that is there, which demands fines and taxes and so on. So those also are being granted here to the donee, right? Then you have those which are okay, this is very interesting. Marriage related tax, which is also being given, right? It mentions a marriage related tax. What is this tax? How much is this tax? Who is to pay the tax? Is it the couple themselves? Is it the parents? Is it only the girl's side? We have no idea about all of that, but something called a marriage tax is there, right? And then on top of all this, not merely are this is in relation to Brahmins, and here it is one Brahmin, Aniruddha, who is being given this. Not merely is he given all of this, but you have certain special privileges also in addition that are given. What is it? He can build these palatial houses with tiles, and have terraces with burnt tiles. That is, it can be paved. The second thing, that he has the power now, he has been conferred the authority to dig wells and tanks. Third thing, that he can grow certain exotic plants which may have a medicinal or other kind of market value, which over which there would possibly have been some embargo earlier. Then cutting of water channels. Again, what does all this mean? Digging wells and tanks, cutting water channels. All of this indicates that this was more of a community related activity, because it was meant to serve the community. Now, in this grant, what we are saying, that the community is being disenfranchised, and individuals like this Brahmin Aniruddha are being given these special rights, even having a house which is many storied, and which is decorated in particular ways. So obviously there are restrictions on these kinds of things for the ordinary villagers, and this is now being conferred on the Brahmin. And also, the very fact that not merely can you dig your own wells, but you can also prevent others from accessing water in your if that water channel is in your land. Yeah, and so on. So these then are very interesting and important elements, which is where then the Brahmadeya as an institutional tool of the state, not merely as a religious institution, but also as a state's institution, is very, very clearly visible to us, because we can see how the state is interfering, is changing, or transforming what would have been community rights into now individual rights, right? Now, and that is what we can see in those kinds of grants. Now, in Rajaraja Chola's time, this is the time when we talk about the imperial expansion of the Chola state. It is something that begins primarily, under Rajaraja Chola, but it is carried forward also by his son Rajendra Chola, and later by his grandson, what's his name? Kulotunga Chola. It's carried forward by these various rulers. And what we do see in these great grandsons, what we do see in these different kinds of the imperial phase during the reign of these different kings is that the nature of the institutions itself is transforming. You have a much larger bureaucracy that can be identified, many more officials who find mention in inscriptions. Again, these inscriptions are primarily, as I've mentioned repeatedly, about religious donations. But you have so many administrative offices and officials that are mentioned over here. And then you also have monumental activity of a scale that is unprecedented. What we have is these grand, large, humongous temples that are being built, huge campuses that they occupy. They are literally like grand palaces of the king. And in fact, what is very interesting is that this is a language that is already employed earlier, where the term for the palace and term for the temple are one and the same. The way in which you address the god and the ruler or the elite is the same. So you talk of the kovil, which is for both as palace and temple. You talk of the Perman or the Permal, which is again something that you find. But what is very, very interesting from the time of Rajaraja Chola, especially, is that the gods are now being named after the title of the kings. So earlier, you could have the kings gaining the titles which are associated with gods, right? But now you have Rajaraja who's giving his name to the temple that he has constructed, this grand edifice in Tanjavur called, which we today call the Brihadishwara temple, but that's a later name that comes. During the time of Rajaraja Chola, it is referred to as Rajarajeshwaram. And this is what is very, very interesting, that the kind of grandiose nature of kingship that is being projected through such proclamations, through such nomenclature, through the very edifices that are being built, through the kind of lands that are being granted, the gifts that are being given. So, in Rajarajeshwaram itself, there are hundreds of inscriptions which are talking about various kinds of gifts, and these gifts are of a very, very huge kind of transactions that we can see. For instance, I'm only going to pick one small inscription because that's all I could do really fit into this slide. So this one inscription which is talking, it's a Tamil inscription which is talking about one village that is granted. Actually, the inscription itself has 3 villages, but the measurements are different. Why I want to point this out is, look at the measurements of the village that is being talked about, of the land that is being talked of. So in this village, what is it telling you about the land? That there are different kinds of measurements of land in different parts of the village, obviously, that are being computed and they are being put together, right? So you have in one part it is 134th and 8 by 20th of a parcel of land. In another part it is 1 by 325 of 3/4, then 320th, etc., etc. So it's very almost strange kind of computing that is there, but which obviously had some value, had some salience for the administrators, because they are being very careful. So this is a village in a very densely populated area, in an agriculturally rich zone in Tanjavur. So it is in that context also that we have to see how. So from the Pallava period to the time of Rajaraja Chola, the nature of the settlements has changed. The kind of density of population has increased, and also the dependence on agriculture and the intensification of cultivation in these areas, as well as the expansion of cultivation to other areas, this has increased tremendously. Now within this particular village, we are told that there is a Jain Palli. That means this is a Jain temple. And then you have a Gani Mutrut. Now this Gani Mutrut is generally identified as something that is given to the Ganis, or who would be the Jain monastics. So it is to the monastery when land is given. And then we are told that, okay, all of this is being given. And then from this, we have to also deduct certain things. We have to deduct certain kinds of things, like the taxes. And sorry, we have to deduct 9 measures of land without any taxes. So no taxes, non-taxable land, that has to be kept away. And then you have other kinds of land also which has to be not computed or not included in the grant. And this concerns the Ur Nattam, or the village residential site, the ponds, the Kammana Cheri. Now, Kammanas are the smiths. They are a specialized caste or a community group, jati, and there is a separate part where they live, so that part has to be excluded. Parayacheri. Parayacheri refers to the area where the Parayas, who mainly form the agricultural labor and other kinds of labor, where they lived. And you have the keeping out of the Chudukade, meaning the cremation grounds and the water channels. So the kind of detailing that you find in terms of land grants. Now, generally, people who write about early medieval India or speak about it, they just talk about how land grants is something that is common. If you remember, I mentioned that across the subcontinent, you have certain features that are in common. Land grants is one of those. But land grants are not the same in terms of the kind of details that are available. And in the Chola land grants, we find this absolute detailing that is available to us, that is telling us about how carefully land surveys are being taken, and how computing of taxes, computing of land that may be donated. So it's not just a generic, let's give the land away kind of thing, but that there is a very specific kind of land that is now being given. And I will end with 2 more slides where I'm going to talk about Rajendra Chola's land grant. So this is the second phase. This is in an inscription in a Tiruvalangadu copper plates issued in 1028. That is the Sanskrit portion, and 1018 is when the Tamil part of the plate was issued, meaning the land grant part of it actually happened earlier. And what do we find in these plates? It talks about a Devadana land that has been given. And again, you have rural settlement, the details of it that is mentioned. You have various kinds of things that are mentioned. But again, here you can see some additions. House gardens are also included, right? And you have cow pens that are also included, hedges that are included, the pidilihai, the hamlets, and various other things that are also included in the gift that is being given. You also have, for the measuring out of the grain that has been produced by the cultivator, you have baskets that are used. So you have a tax on that which is being gifted. not just that, we have a tax on the number of baskets also, which is on the baskets itself, which is being paid. You have a tax on washermen, on potters, on so many other groups that are mentioned over here. And this is something that is quite striking, that what the state is doing is that it is claiming its right over any and every kind of productive activity. And that is where then we see the way in which the religious and political institutions work in tandem with one another. I now come to the last part of my discussion, and here I'm going to be talking about ideology and the way in which it impinges on the religious and political institutions. And here I want to talk about the way in which bhakti, as an ideology which promotes devotional worship, devotion to a god. And these gods are primarily drawn from the epic Puranic corpus, the main focus being Vishnu and Shiva. But then these gods, Vishnu and Shiva, they gather around themselves a family, a pantheon. So all of those gods also then become the object of devotion. And so whether it is a Ganapati or a Vinayaka or Ganesha or a Murugan, or a Devi or a Lakshmi, a Garuda. So, in so many different ways, all these different figures, they also become, the objects of worship. The second thing is that you have a Puranic agamic style of worship that is being given importance. And here in the Purans, going to a place where there is a river, taking a dip over there and so on is recommended. But it is also recommended where there is a temple, you make a tank over there, so as to replicate a holy river like the Ganga, right? So you'll have these Ganga kunds that are being talked of in various parts, Narmada kunds and so on. Godavari and Kaveri are exalted in the Puranas. So the Brahmana ideologues who are creating these Puranic texts, they have some understanding of the geography. So they talk about going to each of these places. They're talking about a network of kshetras, of Tirtha Yatra. The kshetras are those places where you have the gods, say Shiva, in different forms, who can be found, or different acts of grace or of saving the world from the demons that are committed by Shiva. They are commemorated in different places. So you go to each of these kshetras, these places. The tirthas, of course, meaning that you are going to those particular places, and you worship, you take a dip and so on, as I've already said. And what we have is a category of texts called the agamas. Primarily, they are inspired by the tantric traditions. And let me give you just the example of the Shaiva agamas. They are generally divided into 4 padas, and one is the Jnana pada, and then you have the yoga, then you have the kriya, which is about rituals, what is needed for rituals, including how to build a temple, how to make images, etc. And then finally, you have the charya, which is to do with how to worship. And this different objects of puja and archana and so on that are mentioned in these. So using this kind of a textual base, you have these religious institutions propagating the northern Sanskritic Brahminical religion in the southern part of India. and these then are what are picked up by the political authority. The kings who are building these temples, they are to these deities, and they are following the prescriptions that are given in the Puranic agamic tradition as advised by the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas, let's talk about them. They are the most important figure, other than the ruling elites, in this whole way of institutionalizing of religious and political authority that comes up in early medieval India, because they are ritual specialists, as I've already mentioned. They have certain kinds of knowledge. Their understanding of Sanskrit, in particular, is something that is given a lot of importance, and in that sense, they are talked of as cultural purveyors. But I'll come back to this point. They become the genealogists. So many of these ruling dynasties, not merely in Tamil Nadu, but also in other parts of the subcontinent, they have obscure origins. We know that there are some tribal chiefdom somewhere, and that gradually they arrive towards monarchical statehood. And the Brahmanas play a major role in that transformation of these tribal chiefdoms. What they do is they create genealogies for these dynasties that have now emerged, and in those genealogies they use the epic heroes. They also use the gods, the Vedic and Puranic gods. Mainly they follow the Puranic lists of gods that are there in the Puranas itself. There are descriptions of how one god begets another, and so on. So that kind of genealogy is used by them, and it is brought into the genealogies of these rulers of the early medieval period. And it is in that sense that they are referred to as cultural purveyors, because they are not merely bringing a certain kind of religious mythology through which they can compare the kings to the gods, but they are also proclaiming Sanskrit and themselves as the knowers of Sanskrit, as elites in that society. So certain way in which a hegemony is exerted by them in areas like South India in particular, or the Deccan. And this brings me to a very important discussion by Sheldon Pollock on the creation of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, where he talks about the spread of Sanskrit as a political language in inscriptions, which also draws upon uh, 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 a literary mode of expression that is called kavya, which talks in terms of ornamentation. So, kavya involves not merely in its content, but especially in its presentation, ornamentation, the use of a very flowery language, the use of certain kinds of tropes, the use of things like slasha, meaning punning, double meaning, which gives double meaning. So alankara, slasha, and so on. So many of these things which are part of the kavya tradition, which become very popular because of this Brahminical hegemony, where they're carrying the language, but also the kavya, the kavya culture into new areas, and where that is now being established as the elite culture, as something to aspire for. And a very important point raised by Sheldon Pollock is that although we have inscriptions that are in the vernacular language, where we do have vernaculars, like for instance Kannada, or Telugu, and so on. It is in Sanskrit only initially that this flowery presentation of the king, especially in the Prashasti, what is in praise of the king, that it comes about, and that it is only gradually that there is a vernacularization of this Sanskrit cosmopolitan identity or cosmopolis identity, meaning that the vernacular languages are now speaking in that very Sanskritized poetic kavya language, and they are presenting political figures in this manner, right? So I wanted to end with this, that when we talk about institutionalization, generally we leave out the kind of cultural impact of the propagation, especially for this period, early medieval period, of the propagation of Brahminical ideas, gods, myths, norms, and so on. Caste is something I left out completely in this discussion. That is also part of the ideology that is going into the making of early medieval India. Caste manifests in very different ways in different parts of the subcontinent. In Tamil Nadu, we do not have a fourfold caste system. Instead, what we have is the Brahmin and the non-Brahmin. And in the non-Brahmin, we have the right hand and the left hand caste. So this, in which then the asymmetries between those who may be from the same profession itself, like cultivators, like agriculturists, they can be separated into right and left hand. And within that also then there are variations. And then, of course, right at the bottom of that caste system, there are those who are the outcasts, who are referred to in the literature that is being produced by at this point of time, between the 10th and the 12th century. Again, it's devotional literature. It is literature like the Periya Puranam, which is talking about the saints of the Shaiva tradition. There you have references to the Chandals and how they are living on the outskirts of the settlement and so on. So there are many ramifications of the transformation, the ideological, imprint that is left because of the Sanskritization, because of the Sanskritic and Brahminical culture coming to take root in different regions. And in the Tamil region in particular, you find that there's this very interesting way in which then Sanskrit becomes quite interestingly important, and at least the speakers of Sanskrit, or the Brahmins, they are considered very highly. But and this is my submission as a critique of Pollock and others like Whitney Cox, who have taken this forward. Whitney Cox, in his work, has tried to show. What is his work? It's called Politics, Kingship, and Poetry in Medieval South India, where he tries to show how the Cholas actually patronized many Sanskrit literatures. So there was works in Sanskrit that were being produced. For instance, Sharada Taneya, whom I have quoted over here, he is from Madurai. No, and look at him. He is from the heart of the Tamil land, in the sense of what is considered the purest and most beautiful Tamil is being spoken over there. But look at what he says about them, that he actually counts the Dramida language as the Mlecha language. Yeah. And he says that only five, 6 or 7 or of these languages are considered of high quality, and of course in that he puts Sanskrit and Prakrit and so on. So this is what is happening in terms of the transformation. I would like to say that we may look at this, and this is my final submission, that we may look at this in a more complex and complicated way, because while on the one hand, the Cholas in their copper plate inscriptions used Sanskrit. One or two inscriptions which are in stone have Sanskrit, but largely that humongous corpus that I was referring to, it comprises of Tamil inscriptions. And yes, Pollock's um, you know judgment is that because these are primarily to do with material transactions, with something very mundane, they are not really giving you this higher culture or aesthetic which you have in Sanskrit. However, here also he is wrong, because in the Tamil inscriptions from the time of Rajaraja Chola, you have the Cholas in particular who are promoting Tamil and are presenting their own achievements as individual kings in their inscriptions. In other words, they are giving a short chronology of their, they don't even give dates and so on for their various territorial conquests, but their military achievements are mentioned in their May Kirtis. Now, and they are trying to project the ruler in a very specific way. It may not fit the Sanskritic way, but I think we might want to reconsider the fact that a political mode of expression is lacking in Tamil, and that it is only through Sanskrit. And because Tamil doesn't get sufficiently Sanskritized, so these are the complaints against Tamil that Pollock and others have. That they see a lack. Whereas in the case of Kannada and Telugu, there is a very Sanskritic, flowery language that comes up in the political expression, in the description of the rulers and the genealogies and so on. Thank you very much. I'll stop over there, and I look forward to your comments and if you have any.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that amazing lecture. Now we'll move on to the question and answer session. If any of you have any question, you can unmute yourself or write the question in the chat box. Meanwhile, I will take some questions that are coming in from our Facebook Live. Ma'am, can we proceed? Okay. Okay. Obinondita from Facebook is asking, how did the strategic land grants to Brahmanas and religious institutions during the early medieval period transform the agrarian economy and led to a reconfiguration of state authority, especially in regions where centralized power was weak or absent?
Okay. I think that's basically the bulk of what I said just now, which is about how land grants are very central to the change and the transformation that is taking place. But land grants cannot be seen in a simplistic manner, as I've already mentioned. Land grants are not just an act of piety, but they are also one where the king, through the medium of the religious institution, is also increasingly becoming involved in the process of production, in the productive activities in different regions. So certainly land grants are very important to look at that kind of a transformation. And the issue of centralization and so on, I think, is far more complex. It cannot be discussed only in a general way. I think that for certainly the Tamil region that I have been talking about, what we can see is that we can see that during the time of Rajaraja Chola in particular, there is a move towards centralization. And this is primarily because of the institutions that are created by Rajaraja Chola, even creating a political geography. Now, see, regions, let me just go briefly into this. Regions are already known as having an identity, right? You have a region as a Chola Nadu that is known. In the Sangam literature itself, we have, and post Sangam literature, we have this kind of reference. There's something called a Chola Nadu, there's a Pandi Nadu, and so on. Now, what the Cholas are doing is, while aware of these distinct identities, they are trying to change them, or that they are trying to gather them together. And that is where, as Professor Y. Subbarailu has shown, you have the concept of the Valanadu that comes up. So Nadu is an agglomeration of villages. No? The village itself is there at the bottom, then an agglomeration of villages, and above that you have the Valanadu that is there, and right on top you have the mandalams then that are created. So he shows how through inscriptions we can see that these are actually developments that occur during the time of Rajaraja Chola. So certainly, and this is then taken up by Noboru Karashima, the great Japanese historian who worked on Chola inscriptions, who says that this is evidence of the centralization that is taking place.
Thank you, ma'am. Shubhronil has raised a hand. Could you unmute yourself and put the question to ma'am?
Yes. Hello, ma'am.
Hi,
Fascinating lecture. I was remembering our classes. It's a long time back. However, ma'am, I have a question, especially regarding the cult appropriation, the aspect of cult appropriation, because in the formation of region, cult appropriation has played a wonderful role, and your own work on Koravhaya Durga has talked a lot on this aspect. So, if you please tell something more about this aspect and what you are now thinking on this cult appropriation thing.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much for giving me that lead, because obviously I couldn't cover everything and I had left this aspect out. But a very important part of the religious transformations that are taking place, which is why I said one size fits all cannot be used, even when we talk about certain broad features of transformation that are taking place. So there is a Brahminization there that is taking place. There is a Puranic religion that is taking roots in different areas and so on. But the form of that taking root is very different depending on the region and its own history. Now, in the study of B.D. Chattopadhyay, what he shows us through many examples from different, by the way, provenances. One is from Central India, from Rajasthan, and also from Odisha. What he shows us is that there are inscriptions, early inscriptions referring to a particular divinity who happens to be a female goddess, a female deity, as the Kula Devata or the Ishta Devata of a particular tribe, and that they are performing worship to her. And this is written in Sanskrit, and that they are performing worship to her, and a temple is being built to her, and so on. Right, so these are the early references, but gradually in some of these cases, so from the names of these deities also we can make out that they are very much local tribal deities, right? Because it is the goddess of the pot, it is the goddess, the Yakshi, who stands in the Vatavriksha, in the banyan tree. So there are names like this which immediately tell you that this is clearly a local deity. But gradually that local deity is not called by her name, which we know from the earlier inscriptions, but now she is just called Durga, or Durga Bhattaraki, or Bhattaraki, right? So you have this kind of a common kind of name that is used for her. Now, it's very interesting that this deity, this goddess called Durga, she is used very often to mark that transition and cult appropriation and transformation in different regions of India. Now, in Odisha. Again, this is something that is shown by Anne Charlotte Eshman. In her work, also she refers to this. Odile Divakaran, who has worked on Durga, she says that possibly this is because, and Anne Charlotte Eshman also mentions this, and in my own work, I also stress on this aspect. This could be because the epic Puranic mythology portrays Durga as a very aggressive, bloodthirsty character, right, in the stories. And the local deities, the local goddesses, even today, if you go to a local goddess temple, you will find that these are generally understood to be bloodthirsty goddesses. I mean, of course, we have now banned animal slaughter, but we know that there are still places where animal slaughter takes place. Now, I have worked on a place called Rajrappa, where you have the tantric goddess Chinnamastika, and this Chinnamastika is worshipped with the bali of goats. Yeah, and we know, and there is ethnographic evidence for this, whether in Jagannath Puri temple outside um, the temple, or in Kalighat, or in other places of eastern India, a Mahesh is sacrificed during the Navami celebrations, Durgashtami. I think on the Ashtami day, if I'm not mistaken, you have the sacrifice of the Mahesh. At least from ethnographic data, we know this. I don't know if it is still done. Recently, I was on field work in Tamil Nadu, and I found that in a small fishing village over there, the local goddess, there's a lot of Brahminization that has taken place. There is the local priest who is from the community but dedicated to the worship of the goddess. There's a younger person who has, who has also been initiated as a priest. In fact, he is the one who gets possessed by the goddess. So when they have their annual festival, and I had the good fortune of being there at the time of the annual festival, on the last day, this person will get possessed and will want meat and drink and other things, and will go all around the village, and will go to the cremation grounds and so on, and dance. So there's it's a very beautiful tradition that is still maintained. And I mentioned this to my aunt, who is 85 years old, and she told me that this was something that they know of, very commonly in Tamil Nadu. And one of the things is that everyone should leave something out in case the goddess or priest wants to come and stop over there and take something, but should shut their doors and windows, because the goddess should come off inside the house. So this aspect of the fiery, violent, aggressive goddess is something that is very much there in local worship. Now, in the Tamil region, in literature that is available to us, which we call the Sangam literature, there we have references to a very violent, aggressive goddess. She wants, she wants the fallen bodies from the battlefield to be brought back to her. She wants blood mixed with rice to be given to her so that she can have them. She's, roaming the streets in the middle of the night, like that shaman today also. So she's roaming the streets, and it's a threat to anybody who's out on the street, so everybody stays home. So there are all these resonances that you can see even today. But in the Sangam literature, we have such a goddess, and this goddess is called Kotravai, the goddess of war and victory. And she is generally shown as riding on a stag, on a deer. But with the coming of the Pallavas, now we find Kotravai is gaining a new avatar, because what the Pallavas are doing is they are creating a visual space for conceptualizing Kotravai, where she is no longer just Kotravai, but she becomes Kotravai Durga. And that visual space is the temples that they are creating. And in the temples, these beautiful sculptures that they are creating, where you have this goddess as Durga, because there is a buffalo head, a Mahisha pedestal under her feet. And you also have, a lion that is shown near the goddess. But we also have the stag that is shown near the goddess, meaning very clearly they are trying to bring the Tamil and the Sanskritic traditions together. So the nature of cult appropriation would be different in different regions, but clearly in the Pallava, Pandya, and Chola regions, this is, especially the appropriation of Kottravai is very interesting, because Kottravai is already known in the Tamil traditions as the mother of Murugan. Now, what are the Brahminical ideologues doing? Not just Kottravai, they are bringing Murugan also in. So, Kottravai is a form of Durga, who is a form of Parvati. And so, Murugan is a form of Skanda Kartikeya. So, that divine family of Shiva that is portrayed in the Puranas gets so beautifully depicted then in the temples that are coming up, the new Brahminical temples which are purveying Sanskritic culture. Having said that, even in the Chola temples of the time of Rajaraja and later, you have the imagery of Durga with a deer behind her, with a stag behind her that is shown, meaning it is not a neat absorption or appropriation. It's not something where there's an appropriation and you forget the old and there's only the new. I hope I've answered your question, Shubhrati.
Gaurav
Yes,
has
ma'am,
raised.
absolutely. Thank you.
Sorry. Gaurav has raised a hand. Gaurav, could you unmute yourself and put the question to ma'am?
Good evening, ma'am. My greetings. Ma'am, this is a little related to what you were saying. I have also heard of the names Shambhu and Shiv, or Narayan and Vishnu. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that? How have all of these parallel deities been merged into a single god? I mean, Shambhu and Shiv becoming one.
So maybe we should go to Rudra also, and look at how it is gradually only that you have these different forms of which may have been conceptualized as separate divinities, how they are coming together in the form of the Puranic Shiva. In the case of Vishnu, particularly, I would recommend the work of Suvira Jaiswal, where she talks about the way in which the tribal heroes of a particular community, the Vrishnis, include Krishna and Baladeva and Subhadra, and there are actually quite early representations of these figures that are there, and that gradually these figures become more and more important, and they are drawn into what becomes the Vaishnava pantheon, where Krishna becomes an avatara. And the other figure that she talks about is Narayana, where Narayana is where she traces the earliest form of Vishnu worship or Vishnuism as it evolves, that the idea of a lord of the waters. And here, the argument of Didi Kosambi and others, which associate through etymology the Narayana figure with Neer, that it is from there that he emerges, and also that there is a Dravidian provenance and so on. But without going into that, what they show is that you have figures like Narayana, you have Krishna, you have other figures that come in, so much so that within Vaishnavism then they have two ways of dealing with this, which which also is rendered in a very philosophical as well as theistic manner, meaning that there is a philosophy that is attached to why it is being rendered like this. And the theistic is that you can worship each of these separately. One is by using the viewer concept, meaning that there is an emanation from one divinity, and the second is by using the avatara concept, through which you can have then multiple divinities who may be totemic figures for tribes, who may be cult heroes, as I've already mentioned, that all of these are actually being drawn together and worshipped together. Right.
Okay, ma'am, I have a question. Actually, I am very interested in Tantrism. That is what I have worked on in my master's also, and I look forward to doing a PhD on it. My question was that D.P. Chattopadhyay, in his work on Tantra, gives us a rationale behind Tantrism's being goddess centric. He says that Tantra originated at a pre Vedic era when society was agrarian as opposed to pastoral. And because agriculture was an invention of women, there is a predominance of a female centric divine imagination. How far do you think this is a viable historical comment? And is this not, this sounds very binary. That does not sound very historically viable as such.
Well, I might as well let the cat out of the bag. I have a volume on goddesses, an edited volume in which there are many eminent scholars who've contributed. So I hope that will be of great use to you as far as talking about this. Where does the origins of goddess worship come from? I think several essays deal with this, including the introduction. Now, in terms of was it N.N. Bhattacharya? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
No, D.P. Chattopadhyay.
Acha, D.P. Chattopadhyay. There are many scholars, okay, who have talked about this. D.D. Kosambi has himself, referred to this in his Myth and Reality, which is, I think, one of the most wonderful works in terms of trying to understand culture, how cultures evolve, how religions evolve, but looking at culture as broader than that. And he draws our attention to various ways in which we can try and look at remnants and vestiges that are there. So I think that this question is something that if I were to answer it, in a direct way, it would seem too simplistic, right? Where I could argue, and I do argue quite often in my classes, that it is highly possible that given that women had this power of giving birth, that there would have been some importance, some awe with which they were looked at. And it is highly possible, therefore, that the earliest objects of worship were drawn from these subjects who were the mothers in those societies, who were able to be mothers and to produce and to reproduce in terms of giving birth to a child. So that is definitely a possibility. However, we do have a number of instances where it appears that the earliest goddesses we know of are not venerated as mothers in literature, or even in the visual record, that there have been scholars who suggest that what we have is a warrior figure who happens to also be female, who seems to be quite predominant. I think that obviously this has to be contextualized. But I don't I don't reject the first idea. In fact, I would strongly argue that it is the best possible way in which we understand um, a divinity centric worship. Hmm? Uh, in the way in which there is an objectification of woman as mother. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, we should now conclude the session. It is already past 6:30, 7:30. That was an amazing session. I really look forward to your book. Thank you everyone for joining and asking such wonderful questions. Thank you, ma'am, for being with us. I am sorry, but it is past our time. Could you be Dhriti? Could you put your question in a very short way? Ma'am, shall we take Dhriti's question?
I'm okay with taking questions. It's your
Dhriti, you may
you're the
unmute yourself.
sutradhar,
Put
so
your
you
question.
decide.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ma'am, it's really a valuable lecture. And now I am working on cultural history of Pallavas. And I'm going through the inscriptions of Pallavas. And I'm found that there was an inscription called Mallam inscription, where mention head and flesh offering by a warrior to goddess Durga.
Yeah.
So is it a symbolical or a real incident? Can you shed?
Yeah. Actually, you have the Mallam inscription where there's a very graphic description of the offering that is being made to the goddess Durga. But you also have in the Mamalapuram sculptural representations, the offerings of flesh that are very, very clearly visible. When I mentioned that sculpture, a standardized sculpture of Durga Kotravai Durga, that is created during the Pallava times, where she's standing in a Samabhanga posture, and she has the lion on one side and the stag on the other side that are flanking her head. And at the bottom, near her feet, and she's standing sometimes on a lotus pedestal or sometimes on a buffalo head pedestal. But in before her, on either side, you have two people. One who is holding his head up, his mudi. He's holding it up, and he has a sword that he's holding to that head, and he has a sword that he's holding to his neck, as if he's trying to keep his head straight so that he can cut it off. And the other person is holding a sword to the elbow, where he is, or a knife to the elbow, where he appears to be trying to cut off his flesh and make an offering. So this is certainly something that is there in the Pallava context, where you do have these kinds of references. And I have argued in my book on Kotravai Durga that this is certainly one which records some kind of a flesh offering, which Nagaswamy would argue is very much in keeping with the the Shakta practices of a Navakandam that is being 9 parts of the flesh that are being offered as part of the ritual worship. He makes that kind of an argument, but I think it has to be contextualized. In the Mallam case, it is to commemorate someone who has for a particular occasion that this offering is being made.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So now we shall conclude the session. Thank you, ma'am. And everyone have a good night. Thank you for coming here and asking so many beautiful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. Bye-bye, and thank you all for being so patient and listening here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, ma'am.